If you got the balance, I'll pay double. Richard Mason's sarcastic laughter echoed through the most upscale bank branch in downtown Manhattan, making every head turn toward the 52-year-old man who had just asked to wire $30 million. Walter Santos stood motionless, his weathered hands gripping a beat-up document folder. The cheap suit he wore, picked up at a Burlington coat factory clearance, clashed brutally with the luxurious marble and mirrored glass surroundings. His graying hair was slicked back with drugstore gel, and on his right wrist, a thin scar cut across the skin like a reminder of a past he'd rather forget. At 52, Walter never imagined he'd set foot in a bank branch again after everything he'd been through. 15 years ago, his life had imploded in a way that still haunted him during sleepless nights. Today, on this Thursday morning in March, he'd woken up at 5 a.m. in his modest studio apartment in Queens, had black coffee, and decided it was time to handle a matter he'd been putting off for months. "Excuse me for asking," Richard continued, adjusting his Italian silk tie while exchanging amused glances with assistant manager Jennifer Costa. "But are you sure you didn't mix up the numbers? Maybe it's 3,000, not 30 million. The VIP clientele, all in pristine executive attire, began whispering among themselves. Some stifled chuckles behind the latest iPhones. Walter noticed how the embarrassment spread through the room like toxic fog, but remained composed. He'd learned to recognize this kind of humiliation. He'd lived through worse. 30 million's right, son, Walter replied in a calm but firm voice. Need it wired out before 2 p.m. today. Richard Mason, at 38, considered himself a winner. MBA from Wharton, stint in London, penthouse on the Upper East Side, and a BMW in the garage. He built his reputation being ruthless with clients who didn't fit the branch's profile. To him, this situation was the perfect opportunity to flex his authority. Mr. He paused theatrically. Walter, right? Let me be straight with you. This is a private banking branch. Our clients move serious money on the regular. We don't handle basic checking accounts. His voice dripped with barely concealed contempt that made the atmosphere tense. Jennifer Costa, a 35-year-old woman who admired Richard's aggressive style, stepped forward with a venomous smile. Richard's right. There are community banks that handle this type of situation better. Walter studied the pair, then looked around the branch. He saw faces that judged without knowing, cruel smirks from people who'd never faced real adversity. But there was something in those eyes watching him with such disdain, a blind arrogance he'd seen before, always followed by spectacular falls. I get your concern, Walter said, opening his worn folder and pulling out some documents. But I've banked here for over 20 years. Never had issues moving my money before. Dr. Marcus Oliveira, a lawyer waiting in the VIP line, let out an impatient sigh. This is holding up everyone's service. They shouldn't allow this kind of mess. Sandra Reed, a cosmetics company owner, shook her head disapprovingly. This is exactly why community banks exist. Everyone should know their place. Walter had spent 15 years rebuilding his life brick by brick after getting out of prison. 15 years working in silence, investing every penny with a patience few men possessed. 15 years planning for this exact moment, when he could finally prove that appearances were the biggest lie of all. But this morning was different. Walter Santos was no longer just an ex-con trying to start over. He was something far more dangerous to people like Richard and Jennifer, a man who'd learned to play their game better than they ever could. What nobody in that bank knew was that Walter was holding a secret that could turn this public humiliation into the biggest professional nightmare Richard Mason could ever imagine. If you're digging this story of comebacks and justice, don't forget to hit subscribe to see how one underestimated man was about to flip the script in a way nobody saw coming. Mr. Walter, Richard said, his voice dripping sarcasm as he typed something into his computer. Let me run a quick check on your account to wrap up this situation. The monitor's glow reflected on Richard's confident face as he accessed the banking system. Jennifer moved closer, eager to participate in what they considered the grand finale of this morning's comedy show. Other clients positioned themselves better to watch what they expected to be an even bigger humiliation. But when Richard saw the numbers on screen, his smile withered like a flower in the desert. His eyes blinked rapidly, as if trying to process information that simply didn't compute. Walter watched every micro-expression on that face, recognizing the exact moment when arrogance began to crack. This can't be right, Richard muttered, his voice losing all its previous confidence. His hands trembled slightly as he refreshed the screen once, twice, 3 times. Jennifer, noticing her colleague's behavior change, leaned in to see the monitor. What she saw made the blood freeze in her veins. There, in Walter Santos' account, was a balance that made most VIP clients' movements look like pocket change. "Richard," she whispered, her voice shaky, how much does he have?" The question echoed through the now silent room. Dr. Marcus stopped complaining. Sandra set aside her impatience. Even the branch security guard, Josh, discreetly turned his head toward the main counter. Walter maintained his serene posture, but internally felt deep satisfaction. He'd imagined this moment hundreds of times during the long years of rebuilding. Watching arrogance transform into panic was a show worth every sacrifice he'd made. "Mr. Santos," Richard tried to recover his professional tone, but his voice came out broken. I need to confirm some information with you. Could you please come to my office?" "Right here's fine," Walter replied calmly. "The wire can be processed here. Just 30 million, like I said from the start." The casual mention of just 30 million made several clients choke on their own spit. Sandra Reed, who minutes before had talked about everyone knowing their place, now watched Walter with a mix of shock and morbid curiosity. Jennifer, trying to salvage the situation, forced a commercial smile. "Mr. Walter, forgive us. We didn't realize you were such a special client. We'll process your wire immediately." Walter stared at her with eyes that had seen much more than this young manager could imagine. "Special? 5 minutes ago, I was nothing but a hassle to y'all. What changed besides the number on that screen?" The question cut through the air like a blade. Jennifer opened and closed her mouth several times, unable to formulate a response that wouldn't condemn her further. Richard, sweating bullets, tried one last play to regain control. "Mr. Santos, you need to understand our position. We get a lot of people with complicated backgrounds. We have to be careful." "Complicated backgrounds?" Walter repeated, his voice maintaining the calm he'd cultivated through years of forced meditation behind bars. "You referring to the fact that I'm an ex-con?" The silence that followed was so deep you could hear the air conditioning humming. The bomb had been dropped, and now everyone knew exactly why Walter had been treated with such contempt. Dr. Marcus swallowed hard. Sandra tried to mask her embarrassment by frantically checking her phone. Other clients began whispering among themselves, some with curiosity, others with the same prejudice that had motivated the initial treatment. "I was convicted of a crime I didn't commit," Walter continued, his calm voice contrasting with the growing tension in the room. "Spent 15 years paying for something I never did. 15 years being judged, humiliated, and treated like trash by people who thought they were better than me." Richard and Jennifer exchanged desperate looks. The situation was spiraling completely out of control, and they knew every word spoken at that moment could destroy their careers. "But you know what I learned in those 15 years?" Walter asked, his voice gaining an intensity that made everyone in the branch pay attention. "I learned that a person's true measure isn't in their bank account, their degree, or their clothes. It's in how they treat people who seem to have less power." Jennifer tried one last time to control the damage. "Mr. Santos, I guarantee it wasn't our intention to offend you. We just follow security protocols." Walter opened his worn folder and pulled out more documents. What he was about to reveal would transform this embarrassing situation into something far more devastating for everyone who had participated in his humiliation. Because what Richard and Jennifer didn't know was that Walter Santos hadn't just rebuilt his financial life in recent years. He'd done something much more ambitious and dangerous. He'd become the invisible owner of the very institution that was now humiliating him. 10 minutes later, Richard was still shaking as he finalized the protocols for Walter's wire transfer. Every keyboard click sounded like a gunshot to his promising career. Jennifer remained beside him, nervously chewing a perfectly manicured nail, watching the astronomical numbers pass across the screen like mirages in the desert. "All set, Mr. Santos," Richard mumbled, his voice a shadow of its former arrogant tone. "The transfer's been processed. 30 million sent to the indicated account." Walter nodded calmly and put the documents back in his beat-up folder. But instead of leaving, he did something nobody expected. He sat down in one of the leather VIP chairs and pulled out a basic smartphone. "Excuse me," he said, dialing a number. "Need to make an important call." Dr. Marcus, who'd stayed silent through the whole process, whispered to Sandra, "Strange guy. Has all that money but looks like a blue-collar worker. Sandra shook her head, still processing what she'd witnessed. Wonder how much dirty money he moved to get all that after prison. Shady business for sure. Walter, apparently oblivious to the whispers, spoke into the phone with a familiarity that made Richard even more uncomfortable. Hey, Carol. It's Walter. Can you connect me with Joe Roberts? Tell him it's urgent. Jennifer frowned. Joe Roberts was a name she recognized, but couldn't remember from where. Some important connection in the New York corporate world, maybe. Joe Roberts. It's me, Walter. I'm here at the Madison Avenue branch and need to talk to you about a delicate situation that happened today. Walter paused, listening to the response. No, it's not about money. It's about people. Richard felt a chill down his spine. Who was this Joe Roberts that Walter knew? And why did the conversation sound so intimate, like old friends? Listen, Joe, do you trust this branch's management? Walter asked, his voice still calm but carrying an authority he hadn't shown before. Because today I was treated like a criminal by employees who don't even know who owns the bank where they work. The penny began to drop in Jennifer's head like an avalanche. Joe Roberts. Joe Roberts Mackenzie, chairman of the bank's board of directors. The man who signed the quarterly reports, she read religiously. Richard, she whispered desperately, grabbing her colleague's arm. I think we got ourselves into way bigger trouble than we thought. But Richard was mesmerized by Walter's phone conversation, trying to understand how an ex-con personally knew the board chairman of one of the country's largest private banks. Joe, remember when we talked about implementing social reintegration programs? Well, I think it's time to put that into practice. Walter smiled for the first time that morning, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. No, don't need to come down here. I'll handle this internally. Dr. Marcus and Sandra exchanged worried glances. The conversation didn't sound like someone asking for favors, but like someone giving orders. Like someone with real authority over this institution. Walter hung up and looked around the branch, his eyes passing over each person who'd participated in the morning's humiliation. When he spoke again, his voice carried a dangerous serenity that made everyone in the bank shiver. You know what my biggest takeaway from prison was? Walter asked, addressing nobody specific but being heard by everyone. I learned that people reveal their true nature when they think they can humiliate someone without consequences. Jennifer swallowed hard. Mr. Santos, I'd like to apologize again. It really wasn't our intention. Jennifer, Walter interrupted gently, you know why I chose to come to this branch personally today, instead of doing the wire online like I always do? The question echoed through the silent room. Jennifer shook her head, her eyes beginning to fill with tears she was trying to hold back. Because over the past few weeks I've received dozens of complaints about how y'all treat everyday clients. Retirees getting humiliated, small business owners getting ignored, working folks treated like garbage. Walter slowly stood from the chair. I decided to come see for myself. Richard felt his legs weaken. Complaints? What kind of complaints? Walter opened his folder again and pulled out a stack of papers nobody had noticed before. Handwritten letters, printed emails, complaint forms, dozens of them. This one's from Mr. Antonio, a 74-year-old retiree, who was forced to wait 3 hours to be served because y'all decided he didn't have the right profile for a bank account. Walter read calmly, his voice gaining intensity. This is from Mrs. Maria, a shop owner, who cried in front of your own employees because she was treated like a liar when she tried to deposit money from a sale. Each letter read aloud was like a punch to Richard and Jennifer's stomachs. They began remembering specific situations, faces of people they'd mistreated without thinking twice. And this one, Walter held up a specific letter, is from Marcus, a 19-year-old black kid, who was followed by branch security because y'all thought he didn't look like a customer. Josh, the security guard, tried to hide behind a column, remembering the incident perfectly. Walter put away the letters and looked directly at Richard and Jennifer. What he said next would transform this morning into the most terrifying day of both their professional lives. My full name is Walter Santos Silva. And y'all just humiliated the man who owns 51% of this bank's stock. The sound of Jennifer's pen hitting the floor echoed through the branch like a gunshot. Richard stumbled backward, leaning against the desk, his face paling at breakneck speed. The silence that followed was so deep it seemed to suck oxygen from the room. 51%, Walter repeated calmly, watching the reactions around him like a scientist studying lab rats. Acquired the shares over the past 10 years, always through intermediaries and investment firms. Nobody knew who the real buyer was. Dr. Marcus dropped his smartphone on the marble floor, the sound of the screen cracking breaking the deathly silence. Sandra Reed felt her legs go weak, remembering every cruel word she'd said about people who don't know their place. "That's impossible," Richard croaked, his voice hoarse. "You're an ex-con. How'd you get all that money?" Walter smiled, but there was no warmth in that smile. "Ah, Richard, that's the most interesting part of the story. You'll want to know how an ex-con became owner of the bank that's humiliating him." Jennifer tried to speak, but only a whisper came out, "How?" "When I got out of prison 15 years ago, I had exactly $127 in my pocket and a certificate of innocence that came 10 years too late." Walter walked slowly through the branch, his words echoing like hammers. "I was convicted of a white-collar crime I never committed. They spent a decade investigating until they found out I was just the fall guy." The air conditioning seemed to have stopped working. Josh, the security guard, tried to hide completely behind the column, sweating bullets remembering all the times he treated humble clients with suspicion. "The real crew was right here in this bank," Walter continued, his voice gaining intensity. "Directors, managers, auditors, all involved in a scheme that skimmed over $200 million over 5 years. I was just the outside accountant who discovered the discrepancies." Richard swallowed hard, his entire career flashing before his eyes like a movie on fast forward. But how'd you get the shares?" "Settlement, Richard. $200 million for emotional damages, wrongful imprisonment, and destroying my life." Walter stopped right in front of the counter where he'd been humiliated. "Money I used to buy, share by share, the bank that destroyed me." Sandra began crying silently, her tears smearing her expensive makeup. She knew her social life was over. Who would dare humiliate the bank owner and walk away clean? "Mr. Santos," Jennifer tried one last time, her voice broken, "I'm begging your forgiveness. I have 2 young kids. This job is all I have." Walter stared at her with eyes that had seen 15 years of injustice. "Jennifer, you think your kids would be proud if they knew how their mom treats people she considers beneath her?" The question cut deeper than any firing could. Jennifer collapsed in sobs, knowing there was no answer to that question. "And you, Richard?" Walter turned his attention to the manager. "Remember what you said about paying me double if I had the balance? Well, my account has $847 million. How much do you owe me?" Richard tried to open his mouth, but no sound came out. The math of his arrogant promise danced in his head, nearly $1.7 billion. More money than he could earn in 1,000 lifetimes. "But I didn't come here to humiliate y'all," Walter said, returning to the calm tone he'd maintained all morning. "I came to understand how my bank turned into a place where human beings get treated like trash." Dr. Marcus, finally finding his voice, whispered, "What's gonna happen to us?" Walter looked around the branch, his eyes passing over each person who'd participated in the morning's humiliation. "Y'all are gonna learn what I learned in prison, that dignity ain't got a price, and respect can't be bought with money." He grabbed his phone again and dialed a number. "Joe Roberts. It's me again. Can you call an emergency board meeting for this afternoon? We got some major changes to implement." The pause was long as Walter listened to the response. Everyone in the branch held their breath. "No, don't worry about profits. We're gonna completely overhaul the customer service policy at all branches. And Joe." Walter smiled for the second time that day. "We're starting by firing some employees who forgot what it means to serve the public." When Walter hung up, Richard and Jennifer's fate was sealed. They'd humiliated the wrong man on the wrong day, and now they'd pay the price for arrogance that would cost much more than their careers. The ex-con had become judge, jury, and executor of his own justice. 6 months after that day that changed everything, Walter Santos walked through the same branch, but now the atmosphere breathed completely different energy. The changes he'd implemented transformed not just that location, but all 247 bank branches spread across the country. The first change had been symbolic but powerful. At the entrance of each branch, a gold plaque read, "Here we treat everyone with dignity, regardless of background, appearance, or social status." These weren't just pretty words, It was a commitment every employee had embraced after mandatory training on diversity and social inclusion. Carol Mendez, the branch's new manager, greeted Walter with a genuine smile. She'd been promoted from a community branch after demonstrating exactly the kind of leadership Walter sought: humility, competence, and most importantly, unconditional respect for all clients. "Morning, Mr. Santos. How were the visits to the other locations?" Carol asked, offering him coffee. "Inspiring, Carol. Seeing ex-cons getting treated with dignity, retirees getting comfortable chairs while they wait, kids from the projects getting their first business loans approved." Walter smiled with genuine pride. "It's exactly the bank I dreamed of building." Walter had created the Second Chance program, offering microcredit and free financial consulting to people with criminal records seeking reintegration into the job market. In 6 months, over 3,000 people had been helped, and the default rate was surprisingly low, just 2.3%, below the national average. Richard Mason had been fired the same day as the humiliation, but his story took an unexpected turn. After weeks of depression and soul-searching, he sought out Walter personally. The meeting, which lasted 2 hours, resulted in an opportunity Richard never imagined: working as a volunteer consultant for the Second Chance program, helping ex-cons with financial planning. "I learned that technical skills without humanity is just disguised arrogance," Richard had told Walter that day. Now, working directly with people who'd made real mistakes, he discovered professional satisfaction he'd never experienced in his previous career. Jennifer Costa had more difficulty accepting the consequences of her actions. After losing her bank job, she faced months of unemployment before landing a position at a local credit union. There, supervised by a director who didn't tolerate discrimination, she was forced to relearn how to treat clients with respect. Dr. Marcus Oliveira went through an even deeper transformation. Shocked by his own reaction that day, he began offering free medical consultations in underserved communities. "I discovered my degree is worth more when I use it to help people who really need it," he commented in an interview for a medical journal about his new social initiative. Sandra Reed sold her cosmetics company and opened an NGO offering professional training courses for women in vulnerable situations. The woman who once talked about everyone knowing their place now dedicated her life to helping others find their own places in the world. Josh, the former security guard, had been relocated to customer relations. His life experience and ability to identify people in emotional distress made him exceptional at serving seniors and people with disabilities. Walter also implemented Diversity Day, when executives and directors worked as branch tellers, personally serving clients from all social classes. The experience had been transformative for the entire leadership team. "You know what makes me proudest, Carol?" Walter said, watching a young black man being attentively served by an employee. "It's not the 23% profit increase this year. It's knowing we've genuinely changed lives." The bank had become a national reference for social inclusion and corporate responsibility. Universities sent students to learn about the management model. Other banks tried copying the initiatives, but without genuine commitment, results were mediocre. Walter maintained his simple routine. He still lived in the same Queens apartment, drove the same economy car, wore off-brand clothes. The difference was that now his humility inspired others, instead of being a reason for contempt. "I learned a fundamental lesson in prison," Walter would say in talks he gave free at schools and companies. "What defines a person isn't their past mistakes or their bank account. It's how they treat people who seemingly can't return their kindness." That day, as he left the branch, Walter encountered an elderly man being lovingly served by the staff. The gentleman held the employee's hand, clearly moved to be treated with dignity. Walter smiled, remembering himself 6 months earlier. True wealth, he discovered, didn't accumulate in bank accounts. It accumulated in the number of lives you could touch positively, in the dignity you offered others, and in the legacy of kindness you left behind. Walter Santos had proven that the best revenge isn't destroying those who hurt you, it's building a world where that kind of hurt doesn't happen to other people anymore. If this story touched your heart and made you think about how we treat others, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories showing the transformative power of second chances and human respect.